All right, the topic of today's video is, does chain length affect the timing of things? And we're going to talk about that right after this. Welcome back. If you have not seen these pathetic videos before, my name is Rusty Oliver, man. And in previous episodes here, I've been kind of doing some preventative maintenance to my 24T baler here that Grandpa bought new. And one of the things I did was put all new chains on it. And when you put chains on a baler, especially a baler, there is always a worry about things getting out of time and causing much sadness, because there's so many pieces that are set to just miss each other so that everything works properly. And I've heard many a story of people breaking feeder forks and baler needles and different things because they didn't take the time to, you know, check her over and make sure what was happening. So we're going to talk about some different examples here of things and why they are the way that they are. Does chain length affect timing? Sometimes, but not necessarily maybe in the way you think. So when I posed this first question that made people start discussing, it was because some of these chains did not have a half link in, and I put one in like it said in the book, or I took one out in the one case, I think, to tighten it up. But the parts book actually said, you know, it would be like 57 links, and it would be comprised of 55 links of riveted chain, a half link, and a connector link, and that's how they got 57. And, you know, so the question was posed, well, if I were to take one link out of a chain, like let's just use this feeder fork as an example. If I took one link out of that chain, would this feeder fork eventually get out of time to where it hit the plunger? You know, like we set it in time now, but because I took one link of chain out, it would eventually hit the plunger. And I do not believe that that is the case. And I will try to make my point through this video, but you know, I'm sure we're going to have a big discussion and people are going to agree and disagree, and I might learn something because somebody will probably give me the answer that I'm looking for as to why I'm wrong and explain it where I can understand it. But I've always heard that if a chain had an idler in it, you could shorten or lengthen it, no problem, because the idler is taking up the extra links in your chain, you know, so that it all works good. I'm switching gears here for a second, but I saw an example of this, even though it was with a belt drive at the fair. And the point that I'm going to be making with this is, you always have to do your tensioning on the slack side. There's a side that's pulling, and then there's a side that's loose. And if you look at this, you can see that. This is the main drive shaft. It's pulling on that bottom chain and turning that gear. And then as it comes around, you know, this is the slack side. You can't push a chain, you know. It's just along for the ride. The chain's force action is only from the bottom, or this, like from like here on this sprocket to the other side of that sprocket as it pulls it around. But then when it gets up here, the chain, you can't push a chain, you know. So it's just along for the ride. The other side is just connected to it, and it's coming around again until it's ready to do work again. So it's almost like you are pulling and releasing all the time. Energy, you know, you're pulling that chain around, and then it lets up, and it pulls around and lets up. So that's, now back to my story. Why is that important? Why can't I put that idler on the work side? Because you're going to say, what does that matter? You know, you could tension whatever you want. All you're doing is taking up slack in a piece of chain. No. I saw this at the fair in real life example, and so I know that at least with belts, you don't want to do that thing. The problem was the guy had built a corn grinder setup with a hit and miss engine, and he had a nice little flat belt thing on there, and he'd made a fancy little idler. And the first time he had it like laying on the top, and he had just a simple spring holding some tension against it. Well, it would run fine until you'd put corn in it. Every time you put corn in it, the belt would jump off. And he couldn't figure that out. Everything looked good. It all looked in alignment, you know. So he went home and he redesigned it one night, because the fair's a week long, so you got time to experiment. So he goes home. He decides that spring just loosely pulling on there, you know, just to provide a little tension wasn't enough. So he puts a rigid adjuster that, like a turnbuckle thing, and pulls it tight against the belt and thinks, now we got a tight belt, it's not going to jump off. Well, the first load of corn he put in, the belt slings off. And that's when it was realized, hey, I put this idler on the wrong side. I got it on the drive side that's trying to pull, and then that just doesn't work. And so when he moved it, he put it under the belt and used the tensioner to push up. It stayed on there every time. So you need your idler in your slack side of whatever you're doing. Now, why is this important or not important? Well, I'm probably just adding things that are going to confuse everybody. But the point is, will this change timing if I took one link out? I do not believe so on this. And the reason why is it depends on where you would take the link out. If I took the link out of the slack side, nothing would change. However, if I took a link out right now from down there and left this chain in the same place everywhere else and connected them together, then this would be changed by one link of timing. It would be off. If you took the link out of the drive side, it would change the timing, because you're shortening the distance. You know, you're rolling that loose thing around that's being driven, and by one tooth. So that would affect timing. But if I take a link out of this other side, is it ever going to catch up and end up hitting the plunger? I don't think so. So, you know, other people in the comments said, well, the chain could be 100 feet long and it never would hit. And I would tend to agree, I think, because if you look at what's happening here, the people who designed this to start with had to do the correct math to know that this many teeth here, you need to have that many teeth there, so it always stays in the same relationship, you know. So if you had 25 turns of that, it equals to 50 turns of that, and they know that that will never end up hitting the plunger. They also have to know the relationship between that compared to the relationship of whatever gears they got in that gear case, to know that it's not going to gain on each other, one or the other, where it would end up interfering. So I agree with people's discussion on how it doesn't really necessarily matter. Like that's why half links exist, so you can take out slack or you can add a little slack, you know. But it depends on how you do it, I guess, when you loosen it. If you just manhandle it and take it loose and don't loosen the idler and take it out of the tight side and pull them together, why then you've changed the timing by removing a link or adding a link because you didn't properly tension the loose side. So if that makes sense. I'm probably just confusing everybody more, but certain things with chains obviously do not matter, whatever you do. Example, above our head is my hay elevator. You could add or take out all the links you wanted in that thing, and as long as you tightened up the slack with the idler on the end, which is consequently on the opposite end as this, it wouldn't matter, because that is not doing anything other than just carrying material up and dumping it off. So it doesn't matter when those links get wherever they're going, as long as they get there and come back. Likewise, if we look at the chain on this hay rake, it's another example of something that it doesn't really need to be in time with the way it's made. It drives off a gearbox to this drive pulley, and then the basket just gets there whenever it gets there. It goes around in a circle, but there's nothing that interferes or hits that would cause it to have to be timed in a particular way. So this type of thing, you could do whatever you wanted, shorten, tighten, and it's not going to affect anything. I guess we could use this tedder as an example too, even though it's not chain drive. This is an example of something where it has to be in time. And you know, if you imagine instead of those gears like we took out of there, if you had chains and sprockets, you would have to put them in the correct time when you put the chain on, and then as long as you tension the slack side, it should always stay in time. Somebody on the internet suggested that maybe, like this New Holland baler, which is a wire tie baler, that the wire twisters, if you were to take a link out of the chain, you would change the timing. However, I don't think that's exactly true in this example either, because even though the drive gear is also the tensioner, so basically there's no slack side, you know, the relationship of the tight side doesn't necessarily have to change. So as long as you put the chain on with everything initially in the right spot and then you tighten it up and make sure it stayed in time, it should not matter if you took a link out of the chain. The chain could be 100 feet long as long as nothing jumped a tooth. You see what I'm saying? You know, so that might be hard to wrap your head around, but I don't know, makes sense to me, but it does hurt your brain when you think about it. And it's the same way with like corn picker elevators and, you know, elevators in your combine. Their job is just to constantly move and carry stuff, so it doesn't matter, you know, what you got going on. Now, if you add too many links and you got skips in between like paddles and then there's nothing to grab the material, then yeah, that's not real handy, but it doesn't really, it's not going to hurt anything. But a baler has so many things, like I said before, that are interference things, where if you don't do it right, much bad things could happen. And so when we were doing this, I didn't dig out the book. We are going to make a video where I use the book and double check it, because I do want to make sure that we do it right. And it seems like every manufacturer of square baler decided to go a slightly different route with what they were doing. And it's kind of puzzling in a way. And I guess if you look at other makes of square balers like New Hollands or even the Oliver, they use a lot of long chains from up around the front gearbox and comes back to drive things. Whereas the Deere baler here used a short chain from the drive line, and then the rest of this is a shaft driven to a gearbox, and then it goes over, you know, it branches off from the main drive line. So how much of this is important to the timing of the thing? Very much so. And what I was talking to myself, and I might have cut some of that out of those videos, because there's a lot more discussion that goes on with myself that doesn't make it into the final videos when I'm thinking out loud. And every piece of this is really kind of important, but you need to start with this right here, the main drive chain. And the reason you do is because the way they've got it designed, the plunger is driven directly off of the drive line. The drive shaft, you can see, goes in. It's just got a slip clutch here, but this is essentially a straight through shaft, and it goes into that gear case, which drives the plunger. But then there's a chain around that shaft, and then it drives this shaft, which runs everything else. So what this would do potentially, if you had a mistake, even if you had everything else back here in time before you started, let's say, and then this chain broke and you had to replace it, if you just slap that on wherever you're going, the potential issue you could run into is when the clutch here grabs the needles and starts them forward, they could be in there at the wrong time where the plunger is too close or too farther back, and what it'll do is it'll pick up extra hay and shove it against those needles and break them off. And so I think when people hear about those broken needles, they think, oh, the plunger hit the needles and broke the needles. Well, most of the time it's not the plunger that hits the needles unless you had a major meltdown. It's the slug of hay that the plunger's pushing that breaks the tips of the needles off. When this is working the way it's supposed to and everything's timed right, that plunger is pushing back, and it's still pushing back as the needles are coming through, and there's cutouts in the plunger, like I think we've talked about that before. You can't, well, right here, you can see, because this is the plunger face, and then here's your two channels where your needles can come up through there. And what's happening is, as it pushes through there and then the needles come up, then there's other little hay dogs, which you can't see here, but they help hold the hay back while the needles finish what they're doing after the plunger pushes all the stuff out of the way. But if you get it out of time, then hay can get between that plunger and those needles and just cause destruction. And so if that chain comes off and you didn't recheck the timing, what you would end up doing is this piece here only has basically one place where it'll grab that clutch as it goes around. Because when it's time to make a bale, or like if you're just messing around and not feeding in constant material and you trip it, it sometimes takes it a second to get where the place is and then catch it and then make the knot. So you need to make sure that that is timed correctly, because otherwise the distance between the face of the plunger and the needles, the tips of the needles as they're coming in, will be wrong, and then you could get that condition where you're going to end up snapping stuff off. And so really what I'm thinking, and I got the book out a while ago, but I didn't read it real close to see the order, but in my thinking, the first thing that needs done when you time this baler is going to be to trip it, and you bring the needles up to where they're just about to go into the bale case, and then you see where your plunger is in relation to them. And if they are not in the right relationship, you take that chain off, you turn this flywheel and set your plunger wherever it has to be, and then you put that chain on, and it's good to go. And likewise, this feeder fork then will have to be timed, because your plunger needs to be in a certain relationship with this feeder fork, or as it comes around, this could get hit, not this piece here, but the tips of those feeder fork thing could get broke off by the plunger, because the plunger crosses right into where that is. That rakes the hay in front of the plunger, gets up out of the way just seconds before the plunger comes back. So timing is very important in many cases, but it's not necessarily the length of the chain that's doing it. It's more to do with your initial timing of which tooth on the sprocket you have matched up to which tooth on the other end when you put the chain on for the first time. That is the big cause of the timing, and likewise then also some complex mathematics, which I'm not capable to handle, but when somebody designs something, the ratio between small sprocket, big sprocket, or whatever, to know how many turns of something equals something else, so we don't have a problem. Because you've seen things where you can watch them go around and it seems like they gain every so often, they gain a time or something, and they're not quite right, and then they go back into time, and then they go out of time. And I think that is more caused by somebody doing the math not perfect to know what equals what when you change it, you know, because we could do a whole separate episode on just how to change speed on things by changing speeds of sprockets and things, you know. If you have a small sprocket driving a big sprocket, it runs slower. And if you had a big sprocket driving a small sprocket, it would run faster. You know, that's something that you should notice from life. It shouldn't be me, the one that has to tell you that for the first time, but yeah. So the timing is super duper important, is the message, I guess, of this story. But the amount of links you have in that chain really wouldn't be the thing that's going to put it out of time. The thing that would put it out of time is if you don't have the tight side correct when you put it together, you know. If you were putting this together and then you had this chain, bottom chain hanging down, and you didn't really care, and then you just pulled it together up here and connected it, yeah, it probably wouldn't be in time like you intended, because while you were pulling that chain together up here, the whole thing was rotating around to give you the slack that you needed to connect it. So yeah, you need to be doing your work on the loose side, and you need to make sure the other side is as tight as it can be while you're doing it, so that you don't have it change timing a little bit. Now, these things like a baler and pretty well any agricultural machine, I would say that most all engineers had enough sense to know that they accounted for a little bit of timing variation, as maybe you've got a guy who's working on it who's not as precise, or a lot of the old-timey service books were just text. They didn't have picture. It was just a paragraph you read to tell you what to do. Maybe some people couldn't read that and understand it just exactly perfectly. And then, you know, there's human error of when I use my tape measure, maybe it's not in the best shape and it doesn't match. And then the other big thing would be to account for the stretch of the chain over time. As the chain stretches, you know, that's why we have to keep moving our idler down, because the chain's essentially getting longer. And so I believe that most engineers probably accounted for almost up to a link of, you know, of variation in the timing of everything, because as you, yeah, you know, that's why they put in a half link. You can take out a half link, shorten it up a little, and still keep everything in time. But so anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent again. My brain's going a mile a minute, because this is something where you kind of got to think about it to try to explain. I understand it in my mind, but I don't know if I can do a good job of explaining it to others. But it brings up like this right here. Okay, this sticker, there's a shear pin on this shaft. This is the drive shaft that is connected essentially through a gearbox up to that main drive chain. So this will always be in the same, this shaft will always be in the same time as it is up front on the baler. So it says shear pin, retime needles with plunger head after replacing. And you ask yourself, why would you have to do that? If this pin shears off, can't I just put the pin back in and it will be exactly the same? And I got to thinking about that, and I know why they did this. It's because what if when you went to put it back in, you put it 180 degrees out? You know, you sheared this pin off, you didn't know which side was up, and you put, essentially this shaft was upside down, and the gear stayed where it is, and then you put the pin in. Well, then it's going to change the relationship between the plunger head and the needles. You could potentially really have this way out of whack. And like that clutch, if it's got one place to grab that, it would be 180 degrees out of where it was, or maybe not that much, because that's a bigger sprocket than this end. That's, we're getting into some complex thinking that probably I'm thinking too much about. But essentially, yes, when that shear, if that ever sheared this pin, before you go back to baling full bore, you better check and make sure that the needles are correctly timed still, because I guess in this case it would be either they are or they aren't. Anyway, I've never had it shear that pin, but if it did, before I start tearing everything else off to retime it, if I noticed that the needle and plunger head were in the wrong relationship, I would pull that pin and rotate this 180 degrees and put it in and see if that fixed it. It might not, because it might be that this only lines up the same way every 45 times around, because this little shaft is smaller than what's happening up there. I don't know. But like I said, that's all hypothetical and very complex thinking. So anyway, I guess the main point of this was, I agree in the camp that if I take a link out of a chain and it's got an idler in it, I'm not changing any timing. It's not going to make any difference in the grand scheme of things, as long as I don't let the relationship on the tight side change from where I put them originally. As long as I'm only dealing with the loose side, it won't make much difference. But I'm sure there's cases where that's not true, and somebody will probably provide an example. But essentially, like, as long as we keep that bottom piece of chain tight there, the top side of this chain could be 50 more feet. And as long as we dealt with the slack of it. Anyway, we will probably call this video here. It's just a bunch of discussion and nonsense, but it should kind of help clear that mystery up on how that all is. But chain timing or chain length could affect timing if the wrong length is on the driving side, is the main moral of the story. I guess I may not be using correct terminology, but as long as the extra chain length is all on the slack side and you keep everything tight so that it doesn't change while you're connecting the chain, it shouldn't matter how many links you have in that chain. It should always be doing what it's supposed to do, as long as it doesn't jump a tooth or something, you know. As long as the relationship between the driving thing and the driven thing stay the same on the tight side, it should be fine. So I'll be interesting to see what kind of comments people make and how they decide to tell me I'm wrong or don't understand or what mistakes I made, because I'm sure there's probably some, and like I said, there's probably examples of things where everything I said is wrong and it's the opposite. But I think for most of the stuff that I deal with, this probably holds true. And yeah, like I said, we'll find out how bad I screwed it up or what you don't agree with, I'm sure, after I post this. So until then, we're going to say thank you for watching and see you in the next one.